Scott Baum is going to be interviewing her. So you will see Scott up in the little corner like you saw me today with the keynote speaker. And so he'll be talking with her and then she'll be responding. And he will be speaking through a microphone so you can actually hear him as well. I couldn't be heard this morning, but he'll be able to be heard. So Scott will begin with Virginia.
Okay. Can you hear the applause, Virginia?
I did. Can you hear me? Oh, that's very nice. Thank you.
We are so happy to have you here with us.
And I'm so very happy to be here with all of you, even though it's a long way away.
Yes, a long way away, and so many years and feelings and connections over all these years. And I'm
Absolutely.
Yep. Oh, we have a visitor.
There's a dog in the background. It's not ours. He lives below us, but he'll be quiet, I hope.
Well, you and I have talked some, and I'm going to ask you the questions that we talked about, and you'll share your answers. And if it's okay with you, I might ask you to expand some on them, but feel free to alter or add or ask me to bring up something else. But let's start with the professional stuff. Hold on a second.
Okay. Well, I'd like to ask you to please let me know if I need to talk more slowly or louder, okay?
Sure, I will do that.
Now, you have given me permission to read my answers, which I greatly appreciate, to keep me on track.
Sure.
And to be sure we're within the limits of the time limits that we've been given.
Okay.
So,
Okay,
I'll be ready.
let's start with the more professional stuff, and we'll move to the more personal.
All right.
You have participated in the growth and development of this field really almost from its inception, pretty close. Certainly, you and I together were in the first generation of people who had full professional training as bioenergetic therapists. How has bioenergetic theory and practice changed during your professional career? And what areas do you think are in need of further study or further elucidation?
Well, it certainly has changed quite a bit in those years. I began training in 1973, and so did you, Scott, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Yes, and at that time, because I think we were actually the second training group, because our training group, the 73 group, was a little overcrowded. So they had asked another female trainee and I to go to that second year because they were mostly all men. And of course, that was not unusual in that day. It was pretty standard. And what was also standard was that we took off our clothes down to our underwear to have our bodies read. And I remember one instance when I was lying on the floor in my underwear with knees up and legs apart while the trainer was searching for my psoas muscle. I closed my eyes and jaw as tightly as I could, and then when I opened my eyes and looked up, there were 6 or 7 men who were crouching over me, looking down to observe what was going on. Well, thankfully, that approach to training has changed. But that's how we were seen in those days, in our underwear. And I have a memory that relates to how women were heard in those days. In about the late 70s, at the monthly meeting that was held in our New York City gathering place called The Loft, there was a panel discussion with a couple of psychoanalysts, a bioenergetic colleague, and myself, the only woman. I don't recall the theme of the discussion, but I assume we were talking about differences and perhaps similarities in those two approaches to psychotherapy. And at some point, I made the comment, in bioenergetics, we have our bag of tricks, but the most important thing is the relationship. Well, there was no response from the panel or from the audience. And I went home wondering why. And the next day, I was talking with a man who had been in the audience, and I was wringing my hands, and I said to him, that thing I said last night, I was sure I'd get called out on it, yet nobody said anything. What do you think that's about? He was silent for a long moment, and then he looked at me and he said, what was that you said last night? Oh, well. Thankfully, a lot has changed considerably since that time. And there certainly has been the expansion of women in leadership roles. When I began my training, I believe there were only 2 women on the faculty, Vivian Goose and Mickey Frank, and not a lot more in practice. Now there are many women on all levels, including our woman president, Diana, and sad to say there are fewer male members in our institute. We're going to have to do something with that dog. You can hear him, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Sorry about that. He usually is very good. I guess he knows something very special is going on.
Of course.
Of course, our theory has changed to include and emphasize the significance and the function of the relational aspect of therapy. And I think the title of this conference beautifully reflects that. The bioenergetic view of love, authenticity, connection, healing. I love that. I think it's great. So, Scott, you asked what areas are in need of further study or elucidation. I would say there will always be the need for further study and elucidation. Times change, needs change, understanding deepens. To stay on the exact same path is to be narrow and constricted, and ultimately less and less relevant. I think we must always stay open and inquisitive regarding research and new theories while we continue to value what we have been given.
I understand. Let's stay on the track for a moment of the organization.
Yes.
What was your experience like as the first woman to rise to leadership in the organization? Are there any personal memories associated with that experience that you're willing to share with us now?
Well, you and I were the first co-directors of the New York Society, remember?
I do remember very well.
And that was a satisfying time.
Yes, it was.
Yes, it was indeed. Becoming president was a bit of a different matter. First of all, it was a shock to me and to a lot of others as well. Originally, I was asked by David Finley, who has been long deceased, if I would consider taking on the job of the first executive director following Al's retirement. Well, I couldn't even imagine it. At the faculty meeting after I was nominated, I felt stunned and anxious. Bob and I went back to our room in the hotel where we were staying during the break. And Bob said to me, Virginia, put your hand on your heart and just think about your two little grandsons. He was telling me not to get caught up in the politics, but to come back to my heart. That's what I did. Back at the meeting, there was another plan by several of the male leaders, each of whom might well have assumed that he would be the next president. But I was elected, along with Ed Spasta, who was to keep me in line for the remainder of that year. In this job, I was excited to bring in some new ideas and new approaches. Some worked, some didn't. But at the top of the list was changing the organizational structure from a pyramid with the leader at the top to a pie shape with leaders at the center and the possibility of equal participation throughout the organization. And I particularly enjoyed traveling to the various parts of the Institute and giving presentations about the structure, encouraging their input, and extending support.
The work you've done in your professional career, work as a therapist, work as a leader in the organization, what has brought you gratification in these different roles?
Well, as a member of the organization, experiencing changes that have made us a better organization, more relevant, more impactful, has been very gratifying. And this definitely includes the contributions of our members regarding the diagnosis and treatment of trauma, many other things as well. In therapy, that is in therapy practice, gratification when you see, feel the needed and wanted changes as well as in the body of the client. Sometimes after years of work together, and you feel grateful and humbled when a client says or writes, I felt loved, I feel heard, I feel understood. Our work has changed my life. A very important source of gratification. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Okay. A very important source of gratification to me in terms of the organization was in the establishing of our code of ethics in the 80s, which made clear the boundaries in psychotherapy practice that protected both therapists and clients. During the sexual revolution of the 60s and 70s, there were very loose boundaries, if any, in many forms of psychotherapy. While Wilhelm Reich had a lot to do with the sexual revolution, I feel certain that he would not have accepted sexual behavior between therapists and their clients. He had advocated serial monogamy rather than multiple partners and open marriage. I wrote papers and did research for my doctoral thesis on sexuality and the therapeutic process. And at that time, I discovered that there tended to be more boundary violations in standard psychotherapy than in body-oriented therapy. Then in the 90s, female clients began to bring charges against psychotherapists for violations. It was an early version of the Me Too movement. Women wanted to be heard, and they wanted justice. And then came what was referred to as false memories, accusations not proven to be accurate. But through all this, so far as I know, our founder, Alexander Lowen, was never accused of sexual misbehavior or of violating those boundaries. He may have been one of the very few leaders during that time for whom that was true. And I have always been very grateful and respectful of Al for that. And speaking of, anybody want to applaud that one?
Yeah.
And speaking of Al Lowen, he certainly changed my life. I came to him for therapy after having experienced episodes of major depression. And he let me know that I had the right to express my anger, which I never had before. The depression went away, never to return again. I hope I adequately expressed my gratitude to him and to my other therapists as well.
I want to, somewhat in the interest of time and to be sure we get to some of the important points I know that you wanted to share with us today, I want to go to a question about your experience with therapists from different countries and different cultures. It's a little farther down in our discussion. So
Right.
how has that affected your understanding of people and psychotherapy, or indeed how has that affected you personally?
Well, it most definitely has affected me personally, as well as my understanding of people and countries, cultures. When teaching in another country, whether in Germany, Holland, France, Belgium, Switzerland, Italy, Brazil, New Zealand, I always came away feeling I'd learned so much about the culture, about the people, hearing their stories, experiencing their pain. I was having to pay attention to how my understanding of bioenergetics interacted with it. So I learned a lot about therapy and about myself as well. And I'd like to tell what I believe is the most powerful experience that I had in that regard in the late 70s, when I was working with the newly formed training group in Stuttgart, Germany. I remember so clearly the first time I went there as a neophyte faculty member. A trainee took me to the psychiatric hospital where we were to meet. And we walked downstairs into a basement that had been an air raid shelter during World War II. The room seemed absolutely filled with ghosts from the past. Gradually, during the training week, the childhood memories of each participant emerged. Living terror of the next air raid siren, watching bombs fall on the city from nearby hillsides, seeing bloodied and dismembered bodies in the streets, and grieving over dead family members. The thick walls of the shelter contained the screams and the wails that were expressed as they told their stories. And as I heard them, I felt almost unbearable pain. Those were American planes, American bombs. And in the group, there was no discussion of the politics of that period or who started the war, no reference to concentration camps or Allied casualties, never anger expressed toward the invading country. Just the painful inner journey to open old wounds with the hope of finding healing after all those years. When I left at the end of that first week, my body was weary and my soul and psyche had been changed forever. And over the years of teaching, there were numerous experiences of great pleasure and great joy. And along with the unique experiences of the training weeks and workshops in other countries, I have so many memories of visiting the homes of colleagues and group members, having meals or hikes together in their cities and towns and countrysides. I felt expanded and deepened by those times, and I'm ever grateful for them.
Oh, I think there are many people on this side of the screen who are very grateful for all those years you put in with us.
Thank you so much.
Time being always a factor in life, we have about 10 minutes, and I know that you want to say something personal to all of us. So I'm going to leave this space now for you to do that.
Well, a couple of years ago, Bob had fallen and split his kneecap and broke his wrist. And so we thought it might be time to consider moving out of our house, which has many stairs up and down and around. We spotted a villa that we liked at a senior residence community that was very nearby where we lived. So then, just before New Year's this past year, we got the word that the villa was available. We kept hearing about people kept saying in regard to moving, don't wait until you have to. So we bit the bullet. We sold our home of 32 years, had 2 months to downsize to fit into half the space, and say goodbye to a lot of stuff. We felt very good about the choice, though we also thought that we were a little too young to be in a senior residence, otherwise known as an old folks' home. And then, a couple of days after we moved in, Bob unexpectedly put on a recording of Frank Sinatra singing My Way. I'd loved playing and singing that in the 70s, when being in bioenergetics therapy had helped me to know that I had the right to be who I really was, not what somebody else or a belief system demanded of me. However, I had never paid attention to the first two lines, and when I heard them, I stopped in my tracks. And now the end is near, and so I face the final curtain. What? I ran into Bob's arms, burst into tears, and sobbed for a very long time. Well, no matter how long we live, whether it's 10 or 20 years, both Bob and I are facing the final curtain. And that makes it all the more important to express the deep gratitude that we feel. There are many people at this conference and in the bioenergetic community who have meant so much to us. So many memories, so many meaningful experiences over the years. Thank you, thank you, thank you with all my heart for being a part of our lives. Colleagues, clients, friends, thank you. And thank you so much, Scott and Diana and all of you there at the conference, for giving me this opportunity to share some of those experiences and feelings with you at this time. And finally, thanks to all of you for what you give to this wonderful, unique community that is IIBA. Keep it going.
Thank you so much, Virginia. Thank you.
I had the good fortune of Bob and Virginia being my trainers and Virginia being my supervisor. So it was really a wonderful moment to see her and hear from her and all that she's done and all her appreciation for the IIBA and what it stands for and what bioenergetics stands for. So now I'm going to turn it over to Ron Panvini, who's going to introduce, not that he needs an introduction, Bob Lewis, and we'll have a conversation with them.
Good evening, everybody. So I'm going to say a few things. By the way, I too remember the days when we did bioenergetics in our underwear, those good old days. And I just want you to know I am wearing my very sharp red briefs, and I am ready in case we want to relive some old memories. Okay, so before I begin, I got here and I was unpacking, and I found a note that my wife left in my suitcase. And it says, "Ron, when interviewing Bob, don't fucking cry." So I can't. Oh, he's wearing his black briefs, so I can't guarantee that. You know, there are many, many people in this room, and I'm certainly one of them, that had a lot of feeling for Bob and his great contribution to our lives. So I'm going to read a little introduction. before we do the interview, and much of this is Bob's own words. So, some of it is mine. Okay. So, Robert Lewis, MD, one of the few psychiatrists in bioenergetics. That's already something pretty precious right there. Has been a senior faculty member of the IIBA for over 40 years and a member of the clinical faculty of NYU Mount Sinai Medical Center in New York. He has published extensively on the integration of early development and relational issues into the basic bioenergetic approach. I have to read some of this stuff, and we'll loosen up later. He's long been interested in the sensory motor story which trauma engraves into our bodies. He's created the concept of cephalic shock to capture the psychosomatic experience of what Winnicott called the mind as the locus of the false self. His work with cephalic shock, working with the head, voice, and the diaphragmatic connections to the pelvis, goes beyond words. He's found the attachment paradigm deeply confirming of the centrality of relationship in his clinical approach, aiming for moments of encounter in which implicit mystery becomes almost palpable. And I love the poetry of that, which speaks volumes to the work that we do. He leads workshops in Europe and America and summer residential intensives on Long Island in New York. Now, on a more personal note, I have always found Bob to be one of the most enthusiastic practitioners of bioenergetics that I know. When we have clinical seminars in New York, he's the one in the room with taking notes and asking pointed questions, taking things very seriously and engaging. There are times if I have something on my mind, I've read something, I might run it by him, and all kinds of stuff takes place. Emails go back and forth and phone calls, and he just is full of life and enthusiasm, certainly about this work. He's always had great energy and eagerness. And this is this guy at 80 years of age, so pretty great. So tonight we celebrate the long and continuing career of our esteemed Emeritus, Dr. Robert Lewis. Here we go. Okay. So, we're not as organized as... Nah, we're totally disorganized here. All right. So I think my idea was to sort of fill in some detail, some history, because Bob was there really at the beginning of this organization, I think as far back as 1957 or 58 or something like that. But even before that, this is where I'd like to come in. So I picture you in medical school. Did you always want to be a psychiatrist? Into the mic.
Oh, I could swear that I read in Sigmund Freud's some essay on witticism, on wit, and I think it was something to do with wit, but I looked in vain and I engaged a Freud scholar, and we couldn't quite find the quote that I thought that I read, which turned me in the direction of psychiatry, and the quote was that either irony or sarcasm, I can't quite remember, was a reaction to a pain that would otherwise have been intolerable. And I said, oh my God, that guy really knows something. I think I felt the physical pain in chest. When I read that, I felt the pain that went right into my heart when I read that quote. And so then I went to medical school. I thought about closer. What? Closer? I thought about getting. I got to practically chew on it, right? And didn't we get a thing about the tongue? I did, yeah. So medical school was tough, and I had a bad case of influenza. And after that, I had a burning sore throat, and I tried medicines, and nothing worked. And I realized that something was catching up with me. When I was about 14 or 15, during some sort of summer camp, work camp experience, I was with a half a dozen young people in the presence of a very warm male counselor. And out of nowhere, I was attacked by some sort of personal anguish, and I lost control of myself and sobbing. And then I pulled myself together and tightened all the muscles in my neck, head, and all the muscles that we know exist. And that, I think, was catching up with me then with this influenza some years later. And somebody knew about a psychiatrist that worked with the body. So I started therapy with William Walling, who was one of the three people who founded Al and John Parakos and William Walling. William and John Parakos were fellow psychiatrists, about the same age, about 10 years younger than Al, or maybe 15. And so I didn't want to know that the pain that I had in my throat was the cry that was basically blocked and shut off in me. And gradually Bill got me to face that. Didn't say anything about it directly for a year. So you asked me a question a long time ago, and so bioenergetics became my second family. Al, there was a tremendous excitement. Al was publishing his first book in 1958, The Physical Dynamics of Character Structure. And one time I was in the waiting room, and John Parakos came out, and he was wearing his suit and his vest. He always had a vest. And he didn't know me at all. He said but he knew I was a young person who was interested in bioenergetics. He said, "What are you going to study?" And I said, I think I'm going to study medicine. And as only John could, he said, "That is a really wonderful thing, Bob." And I felt this blast of warm air come into my chest from John's presence. I never forgot that. And so I was in therapy for quite a while with William Walling, and he had polio just before the before the Salk and the Sabin vaccines came out, and he had a withered leg and a brace, and it was hard for him to stay healthy. And before I tell you that story, my model of bioenergetics changed slowly. At first, I was very nervous whenever anybody said they disagreed with any of Al's statements or his books. I sort of, bioenergetic theory was a transitional object for me or something like that. And then there was a workshop with Al, John, and William Walling, and I think John Bellis was in the fourth corner of this William Walling Hall, and patients had the pleasure of rotating their way through the four corners, and they were worked on by each of these star therapists. And although I was suffering from over-idealization, I was not psychotic, so I noticed that each of the therapists worked on and saw something different in the patient. So I got it finally that there was no bioenergetic truth. There were only truths. And then I began to realize that the truth that was registered had something to do with the observer, and that they were mutually interacting with each other. And so my model of clinical reality changed. And then Bill Walling died suddenly while I was in therapy with him. And Al called me up, and that was a tremendously important moment for me. Al was extremely warm and extremely sensitive. He knew that I was going to be hit really hard by the news, and he spent just as much time on the phone as I needed, and I never forgot that. He was just the way I needed him to be. And then I have another Al story. Gradually I found my own voice, and I walked a tightrope for a number of years where I spoke my truth and managed not to get kicked out of the Institute at the same time, because Al was not, his strong point was not having people with different views under the same roof. And, but there was an affection, a deep affection that we both had for each other. And so I wrote a paper, I forgot which paper it was, and he wrote me a very angry letter in which he declared that I was a narcissist because he found that 25 times when I mentioned me or I in the paper, I'm not sure how many times. But even after he let me know how angry he was, he said, "But you can call me up if you want to have dinner." You know, he left the door open. And so for 30 minutes I had intense anxiety, and then I said, okay, I'll call him up. And I'm sorry, it doesn't taste good, you know? And so I went down, prepared to have dinner. Al opens the door, and, you know, in an enthusiastic way that Al, bright-eyed, and, "Hi, Bob. I said, how about we're going to have dinner? He says, yeah, but first I have a patient in there. He was working with a patient, and he has that stuff that you're writing about with the head. Would you work with him? And that was the way Al was. You never know what he was going to do next. So I said, let me talk to him for a minute. I talked to the guy, and it seemed like it would not be too crazy to work with him. And I worked for about a half an hour with him, 30 or 40 minutes, and Al sat quietly in the corner. And after the patient left, Al came up to me and he said, "That was really nice work, Bob." And I said, "That's all I ever wanted from Al. I just didn't realize he would be that appreciative." And he was that way in private.
So did you make it to dinner? And did he pay?
I think I was pretty full.
That was it?
That was it. I don't know. I think, yeah, we did. But he was that way. in his private moments, many people would confirm what I said, that he could be gracious and warm and supportive, but that didn't necessarily translate to him acknowledging you, because he had a complicated relationship with Reich, for whom he felt he was the spokesman, and he stood for that ideas that were his ideas as inherited from Reich, and so it was a little complicated.
So let's see. Okay, here I am. So you said a lot of stuff. Remember, I only asked one question. Did you? This is like live TV, right? So there was a time when I believe you saw the bioenergetic model as somewhat incomplete. It needed something else. Maybe you want to talk a little bit about that and how you brought in other modalities or other concepts into the model.
Yeah, well, I took a 4-year residency that involved 2 years of adult psychiatry and 2 years of adolescent and child psychiatry. So I had a framework, a developmental framework, which I thought could be written more explicitly, and my early papers tried to do that. You know, I talked about the process whereby you stood erect on 2 feet as Al sort of took the Reichian lying on the bed, and he made that important contribution, but I filled in a little bit of the developmental crawling stage, so to speak. And I also knew when William Walling died, when my therapist died, I felt on some level like a fragile infant. I don't think that we worked on my sub and pre-verbal issues. And I think that there was a collusive arrangement with my first therapist in which he was either doing body work or we were talking. And whenever I sensed that we were running out of things to say and there was going to be silence, as they say in German, Stille herrscht. And I panicked, and because I think at that point I would have gotten in touch with some of my early issues, Winnicottian issues. And so, like everyone here, I made my contribution in some way by looking at what my inadequacies and incompleteness of healing were about. And I followed Winnicott very closely with offering an alternative interpretation of a mind-body split to the one that Al and Reich represented. They were complementary as far as I was concerned.
And did that awareness lead you to the concept of cephalic shock? Was that?
That's what I'm saying. And I had an immediate. I sensed that there were things that weren't written into classical bioenergetics because nobody covers everything, and Bob Hilton and his partner Renato Monaco. I don't know if anyone knows that name. We're leading a workshop in good old California, and the faculty, I guess it was a conference, we were all supposed to experientially find out what the character types were about. And when we were doing the schizoid character, we were supposed to lean back to back and put our heads against each other, and I couldn't do it. I sort of could do it mechanically, but I couldn't really trust my head to someone else. And that, I figured out that something was wrong. Because I looked around and the other people seemed to be doing it, but I knew that I had an issue. And that, and then you always see your issue in all your patients. I mean, I was following a tradition. Al did that, and he worked on issues that were meaningful to him, and he saw them in his patients. And so I think I wrote a paper in which I said that I think Al was working on his version of cephalic shock. You know, anybody can differ with me, but he was working on exercises and somersaults and various things to really connect his head with his total body and in a grounded kind of way, well into his high 80s and maybe even beyond that. And I just didn't have any choice. I had to go head first because that's the way it worked for me. Can you hear me? Yeah. So.
Okay, so we're going to be winding down fairly soon, but maybe do you have some thoughts on how bioenergetics has evolved? What do you see currently? What are you aware of, or insights you might have into where the Institute is or the way we practice in these days?
I think we're doing pretty well, and I know Ron and I have a dialogue, and he asks me things like, do I think that the body has been somewhat neglected or less emphasized since we've been into relational, more of a relational equation. And I think there's going to be a back and forth, and we have heterogeneity of views. I just recommended in my workshop a book by a psychoanalyst he's not a body-oriented person. His name is Stephen Knobloch, and Jörg Klauer is quite familiar with his work. I think maybe Jörg first. Jörg put me on to Stephen Knobloch. He's in New York, and he's an amateur saxophonist. He has a musical background, and he works with the tone and the tempo and the rhythm and the pitch and the turn-taking of dialogue between him and the patient. And he writes things like, I felt the patient's tone in my diaphragm. And I consider that whatever you want to label him as, he's doing an elegant and exciting kind of work. And I think we have to learn wherever we can learn, and not give up our central core bioenergetic Reichian principles, which I hope I haven't given up, and I don't think my interest in all of those things has weakened my connection. And when I do co-workshops with Ron, in the New York Society, I love the experience because I see him doing things that I wouldn't have done, wouldn't have thought of done to do, and so we're not clones, and we do different pieces of work out of who we are. But I have a pretty good feeling about our vitality and our openness to things that we need to be open to. We need to pay attention to some neuroscience. I read the neuroscience, and I love it because I went through medical school, and I can say the names of the nuclei and the tracts and all those things, but I don't think about them when I'm with a patient because it would be a disaster. So, so the answer is, I think we're a more complex. We work with a more complex. What is it called? Model. we don't want our model to be simpler than reality. I said that reality is complex, and sometimes the mind-body truth that our work offers is palpable and powerful, and it cuts right through a myriad of words and fog. But on the other hand, we don't want to ignore the relational significance of what we're doing, because if we can realize it, most things that you do and intervene with patients, they mean something to the patient. And it used to be, just for an additional comment, that it didn't matter, so to speak, what the patient's subjective experience was in the Reichian understanding, because when you got down to curing the biopathy that supported the superstructure of the neurosis, there was going to be no neurosis, because you were going to cure that, you were going to get the healthy sexuality and the protoplasm would be flowing. But that's not quite the way it works in my experience. There's always some piece of your subjectivity that is aware and is ashamed or has feelings. And if you don't elicit that, you're not working with the whole organism.
And that's what it seems you saw in the differences in the way the 4 or so therapists were working. It seems like you were in tune with that from a kind of bookends in a way. It was there when you started, and it seems to be there now in your perception that things are complex, they're not simple. We can't just have a one-size-fits-all process, right?
Well said.
All right, folks, I think that's it. We could open it to questions if you have some questions, but I think we're staying with the structure and the time. So how about a hand for Bob Lewis?